April 3, 1945. A patrol from the United States 11th Armored Division approached a farmhouse near Rutzburg, Germany. A white flag hung from the upper window. 3 civilians stood in the doorway, hands raised. No weapons visible. The war was almost over. Everyone knew it. German units were surrendering by the thousands. This looked like 3 more. The American sergeant leading the patrol stepped forward. He told his men to lower their weapons. He was 15 feet from the doorway when the first shot hit him in the throat. The civilians dropped their hands. Submachine guns appeared from beneath their coats. In less than 5 seconds, 3 American soldiers were dead. 2 more were wounded. The attackers retreated inside the farmhouse. When reinforcements arrived, they found 3 bodies. Not civilians, SS soldiers. The white flag still hung in the window. That moment was not an accident. It was a signal, because across Germany, the rules of war were beginning to collapse. By April 1945, the Third Reich was dying. Allied forces were advancing from the west. Soviet armies were closing in from the east. German cities were in ruins. Supply lines were broken. Entire divisions were surrendering without a fight. To most soldiers, the war's end felt inevitable. But within the Nazi leadership, a different plan had already been set in motion. It was called Operation Werewolf. The name came from German folklore, a creature that looked human, until it revealed something far more dangerous beneath the surface. The concept behind the operation was simple and deeply unsettling. German fighters would abandon uniforms, blend into civilian populations, and continue the war from the shadows. Ambushes, assassinations, sabotage, and most dangerously of all, deception. They would use the very symbols of surrender and safety as weapons. White flags, civilian clothing, false surrender, anything that could bring an enemy close enough to kill. The werewolf program was organized under Heinrich Himmler. The SS recruited volunteers who were willing to fight to the very end. They trained them in small unit tactics. Hidden weapons caches were placed across Germany. Propaganda broadcasts encouraged civilians to join the resistance. The message was clear. Even if Germany lost the war, the fighting would not stop. On paper, it was a terrifying strategy. In reality, the movement was poorly coordinated. Many recruits were teenagers. Some were old men. Training was inconsistent. Command structures were weak, but they did not need to be perfect. They only needed to be dangerous, and they were. In the final weeks of the war, dozens of American soldiers were killed in ambushes, not by uniformed troops, but by men pretending to surrender, men hiding behind white flags, men dressed as civilians. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological damage was enormous, because suddenly, nothing could be trusted. American soldiers had spent years learning the rules of war. Civilians were not targets. A raised white flag meant surrender. A surrendering enemy was to be treated humanely. Those rules created order. They allowed discipline. They separated war from chaos. Now those rules were being used against them. Every white flag might be real, or it might be a trap. Every civilian could be innocent, or could be waiting to kill. The soldiers began calling it something simple: white flag fever. It spread quickly. Units became suspicious, then cautious, then paranoid. Some soldiers began firing before verifying. Others refused to accept surrender at all. Men approaching with raised hands were sometimes shot before they could speak. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline, because every hesitation could mean death, and every mistake risked becoming an atrocity. This was exactly what the werewolf planners wanted. They wanted to break trust. They wanted to turn American soldiers into men who no longer believed in rules, because once the rules collapsed, everything collapsed. General George S. Patton understood the danger immediately. Patton was not a cautious man. He believed in speed, force, decisive action. To him, war was not about negotiation. It was about breaking the enemy's will, completely. But he also understood something deeper. If American soldiers stopped believing in the rules, they would lose more than discipline. They would lose control. And once control was gone, the war would become something far worse. When reports of white flag ambushes reached his headquarters, Patton did not hesitate. He called in his commanders. He gave them an order, clear, direct, unmistakable. If a building displays a white flag and that building fires on American troops, you will not clear it. You will not surround it. You will destroy it. Completely. No exceptions. Patton's order moved through the chain of command with unusual speed. Within hours, division commanders passed it down to regiments, regiments to battalions, battalions to company commanders, and finally to the men on the ground. The instruction was simple, but its implications were enormous. American forces in Germany were heavily equipped. Thousands of Sherman tanks, tank destroyers with high-velocity guns, self-propelled artillery capable of leveling entire structures. These weapons had been designed to fight German armor. Now they would be used differently. Not against tanks, but against buildings, against any structure that used deception as a weapon. The reasoning behind the order was not emotional, it was tactical. Clearing a building room by room was one of the most dangerous tasks in warfare. Every doorway could conceal an enemy. Every staircase could become a killing zone. Every corner could hide a weapon. When soldiers entered a structure, they gave up visibility. They gave up control, and they exposed themselves to ambush at close range. But a building could not fight back against artillery. A sniper could not survive a direct hit from a tank shell. If the enemy chose to turn buildings into traps, then those traps would be removed completely. It was not subtle. It was not gentle, but it was effective. The first clear example came just days later. April 7, 1945, near the town of Coburg, an American reconnaissance patrol spotted a white flag hanging from a two-story house. Under previous rules, they would have approached carefully, called out, attempted to accept surrender, but the rules had changed. The patrol took cover instead and called for support. Minutes later, a Sherman tank rolled into position. It stopped roughly 300 yards from the building. The tank commander used a loudspeaker. He issued a warning. Anyone inside had 30 seconds to exit. Hands raised. Walk toward American lines. The countdown passed. Nothing moved. No one emerged. The house remained silent. The commander made his decision. The Sherman fired. The first high-explosive round struck the upper floor. The impact tore through the structure. Wood splintered. Windows shattered. Smoke poured from the openings. The second round followed immediately. Then a third, then a fourth. Within seconds, the building began to collapse. The roof caved inward. Walls cracked and fell. Dust and debris filled the air. And then came the confirmation. Secondary explosions. Small, sharp detonations from inside the ruins. Stored ammunition. Hidden weapons. The house had not been a home. It had been a trap. When American infantry approached the rubble, they moved cautiously. Weapons ready, expecting resistance. They found none. Inside the remains of the structure were 3 bodies, all wearing SS uniforms beneath civilian clothing. Nearby, hidden among the debris, was a cache of weapons, submachine guns, rifles, grenades. The white flag had been a lie, but the outcome had changed. No American soldiers had died. The ambush had been stopped before it began. News of the incident spread quickly, not just through American units, but through German resistance networks as well. The message was clear. The rules had changed. White flags no longer guaranteed safety. Buildings were no longer protection. Deception no longer provided an advantage, because now it carried a cost. An ambush that might once have killed a few soldiers now guaranteed destruction. Total destruction for those inside. The effect on American troops was immediate. The fear did not disappear, but it changed. Soldiers no longer felt forced to walk into uncertainty. They had an alternative. They had firepower. They had control. They had a clear rule to follow. If the enemy honored surrender, they would be treated as prisoners. If the enemy used surrender as a weapon, they would be eliminated. The uncertainty began to fade. Discipline returned. Confidence followed, and with it, effectiveness. For the werewolf fighters, the situation reversed completely. Their strategy depended on surprise, on trust, on the expectation that American soldiers would hesitate. Now that hesitation was gone. An ambush was no longer an opportunity. It was a death sentence. Attacks decreased, not because the fighters lost their will, but because the mathematics had changed. The risk was no longer worth the reward. As April 1945 moved toward its end, something changed across the American lines. The ambushes did not completely disappear, but they became rare. Where once patrols had walked toward white flags with hesitation and fear, now they approached with control, or they did not approach at all. Buildings that fired were destroyed, without delay, without negotiation. The shift was not just tactical, it was psychological. The werewolf fighters had expected confusion. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they encountered certainty. And certainty removed their advantage. An ambush that once might have killed 2 or 3 soldiers now ended with the attackers buried beneath their own position. The strategy that had relied on deception began to collapse under the weight of its own consequences. Not everyone agreed with Patton's approach. Even at the time, some officers questioned it. Historians would later debate it. The criticisms were real. Not every white flag was false. Not every building held enemy fighters. There was always a risk. Civilians could be inside, families, refugees, people who had nothing to do with the war. Destroying a structure without entering it removed the danger for soldiers, but it also removed certainty. War rarely offers perfect solutions, only choices between risks, and Patton made his choice. The alternative was clear. Send infantry into every building, clear it room by room, lose men to ambushes, watch fear spread, watch discipline break down, and risk something far worse. Soldiers who stopped trusting anything, who stopped distinguishing between enemy and civilian entirely. That path did not just cost lives, it destroyed control, and once control was gone, the war would become something else entirely, something without rules. Patton refused to let that happen, so he created a line, a simple one. If the enemy respected the rules of surrender, they would live. If they used those rules as a weapon, they would lose every protection those rules provided. The impact of that decision became clear in the final weeks of the war. Patton's Third Army advanced rapidly across Germany. They captured more than 500,000 German prisoners. Entire units surrendered. Towns fell without resistance, and the feared werewolf insurgency never materialized at the scale Nazi leadership had promised. There were attacks. There were isolated incidents, but there was no sustained resistance. No widespread guerrilla war, no collapse of Allied control. The strategy had failed, not because it lacked intent, but because it could not survive against overwhelming force. The events of April 1945 revealed something fundamental about warfare. Rules matter. They exist to limit destruction, to create boundaries, to protect both soldiers and civilians. But those rules depend on one condition. Both sides must respect them. When one side turns those rules into weapons, they do not bend the system, they break it. And when the system breaks, the response is no longer about fairness. It becomes about survival. Patton understood that. His decision was not about revenge. It was about restoring order. He made it clear that surrender still meant something, but only for those who meant it. The white flag would remain a symbol of mercy, but it would no longer be a shield for deception. The men who hid behind white flags believed they had found a weakness. They believed that decency could be exploited, that mercy could be turned against the enemy, but they misunderstood something important. Decency is not weakness. It is a choice, and like any choice, it can be defended, when necessary, with force. The war in Europe ended just weeks later, but the question raised in those final days still remains. What do you do when the rules no longer protect you? When the enemy uses trust as a weapon? Do you hold to those rules no matter the cost? Or do you change them to survive? There is no easy answer, but it is a question worth thinking about. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more powerful cinematic stories from history, make sure to subscribe. Because some of the most important moments are the ones where there was no perfect choice, only the decision that had to be made.